Topic that I don't like, and I assume I got assigned it because Abuna doesn't like it either. And the reason I don't like it is because I haven't prepared it before. I'll tell you more about why I don't like it later. But we're talking about the end of times. The reason we talk about the end of times, for those of you who heard the gospel today in the sermons, the last 2 weeks of the year, the gospels are dedicated to the final things that are going to happen. It's to remind us to be vigilant. And so many people get so excited about hearing about the end of times. They want to hear the signs, and they want to study the wars and the earthquakes, and they get all excited about these things that are terrible. For some reason, we have a fascination with things that are terrible. So what if I told you I did a lot of personal studying, I listened to a bunch of commentators, and they've examined all the events, and they said the end of times is not for another 100 years. Everyone's like, that's great, right? Then what if I said, well, actually, I did my own studying again, and I got a vision, and it's actually going to be in 2 weeks. How you respond to that question says a lot about where you're at. Are you excited that Christ is coming in 100 years? Are you terrified that He would be coming in 2 weeks? And I think that is why I don't like this talk for a lot of time. By the way, when I say it could happen in 2 weeks, I'm usually off up to 14 days. So, if I cared about you a lot, I'm not saying I don't, I do care about you a lot, but which one would I tell you? That it's going to happen in 100 years or 2 weeks? Clearly, that I told you that it is coming soon, because then you might take it seriously. But people focus on the signs, and when they see the signs, then Hollywood makes another movie about it. And we're not talking about predicting. We're talking about participating. It's like getting the news about Stormageddon, and you see it's coming. It's getting colder, and it's getting colder. And you're like, wow, it's awesome. It's coming. You're sitting on your deck in your flip-flops, and you're like, hey, Stormageddon is here. You've seen it coming, but you've done nothing to prepare for it. The reason I happen to be here in Virginia this weekend is very related to this topic as well. It was the end of times for my grandmother. And, people have been saying, we offer you your condolences and everything, which is much appreciated. You guys are wonderful. But she was a very godly woman, and I'm not sad for her at all. But it was the end of times. So I attended a funeral, and these two topics together are very eye-opening. And the whole thought when you attend a funeral is, are you ready? Are you ready? Now, I'll be honest, I've attended more funerals than I have second returns of Christ. I bet all of you have too. The likelihood of attending another funeral before the return of Christ is likely. And I'm wondering if the next funeral I attend could be my own. Am I thinking about the funeral, or am I thinking about the second coming? I almost likened it to me worried about getting Alzheimer's disease when I'm 80 versus dying from a heart attack at the age that I'm at now. Shouldn't I be prepared for that moment right now? So how can I be prepared for not the end of all times, but the end of my time? It reminds me when I was in 5th grade, it was the day after Halloween, and one of our classmates didn't come to school that day. And our teacher told us, well, she was trick-or-treating with her friend, and her friend tripped and hit her head on the ground, and she died. Just like that. And I walk a lot. I mean, like every day. I mean, it could happen to me. So it makes more sense that I'm prepared for my end time. So this talk will be given from a perspective of what if it was to happen in a week or two. So I found some verses in the Bible, and this one was actually read yesterday at the liturgy we attended. The end of all things is at hand. St. Peter is writing this in the first century because there's a lot of persecution. A lot of them could die. He says, the end of all things is at hand. Be serious and watchful in your prayers. In other words, pray with urgency because the end of all things is coming. What if you knew that you had a week to live? Do you think your prayers would be any different than they were yesterday? Would your prayers change? I know that this church loves the Agbeya. And I have a friend, we joke about certain things. What is your favorite psalm in the Agbeya? The favorite one you like to pray at night? And we were joking about this. So it's the last line. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is he who repays you for what you have done to us. He who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. Alleluia. You're like, what? What did you just read? You just read it just like that. And we joke about it because we don't take that psalm seriously. But then when I thought, if I did have a week, and I'm going to read this psalm, I'm going to pay attention to the most important part of it, where it says, how can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. See, we read the Psalms every day, but we're reading them oftentimes not with a sense of urgency. If I told you that you were going to live for 1 week, what would be the most important things for you to pray about? You'd probably remove few certain things, right? Like your football teams in Washington, there's no hope. Just drop that one. You're going to let that one go. You probably won't pray for your finances. You probably, what would you be praying for if you had 1 week? You wouldn't just pray that your kids get along with their friends at school. What would you be praying for? You would be praying with this great intensity that your kids will go to heaven. You'll be praying for all your friends that don't know God or that are distant, and you will be on your knees and you will be weeping. It is sad, oftentimes, and I know this church is familiar with this, and I had the very similar situation as well, but like when someone gets a cancer. So, it's been about 8 years or so, I had a brain tumor, and then they had a prayer meeting at church, and a girl who wasn't that close to church, she came to the prayer meeting, and she says, I've never prayed like that before. And I said, that's awesome. But does someone have to have a tragedy in order for us to pray with intense urgency? It shouldn't have to be that way. I don't want you to pray just to pray. I want you to pray to connect. That's why we're praying, right? Because if Christ is coming back in a week, or if I'm going to Him, I definitely want to be connected to Him before I get there. I would be on my knees repenting. Do you know the story of Saint Baisa? I love this saint. She was born to Christian parents, very wealthy, and they died while she was young. They left her all their money, and she was a wonderful, godly girl, and she donated to the poor. Left and right. She donated so much, and she never thought of a way of increasing the money. She donated until she had nothing left. Well, her friends said, well, we need to find a way for you to make money, and they kind of influenced her in the wrong way. She ended up opening a brothel. She was running a house for those kind of people. When the monks heard about it, they were so worried, and they went and sent St. John the Short to go talk to her. So he went to the brothel, he met her, and then he asked her a question. He says, What is it that Jesus did to you that you're so upset about that you left him? And then he began to cry. And she said, why are you crying? He says, because I could see devil has taken over your heart, and I see him playing around your face. And she says, is the path of return still open for me? He says, absolutely. She said, take me. So that night, he was going to take her to another place. They went through the wilderness, and so they had to rest that night. So they slept in different areas, she over there, he over here. And while he was praying, he saw a light from heaven, and then her body was taken. Her soul was taken. And he said, God, why did this happen? She was just beginning to pray. She was just beginning to repent. And then he heard a voice that said, her repentance was perfect. And so I took her. I mean, she must have prayed with such urgency, like the best prayer she's ever prayed. Now, I don't want this to make you afraid of praying your best prayer. It might lead to more good prayers. God may not take you once you pray it. But when was the last time you prayed with such urgency, where your heart was just pouring out because you cared about all these people and you definitely wanted to be straight with God? When was the last time? I want you to begin to pray urgently. The next thing, I just read a book, and it really opened my mind. And so I wanted to add this verse here. See then that you walk circumspectly. You know what circumspectly means? Like where you're looking exactly where you're going. It says, not as fools, but wise, redeeming the times. Because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be unwise, be understanding what the will of the Lord is. Redeeming the time. It means giving value to your time. We've all been granted a certain allotment of time. I don't know if you accept this, but many of you, actually almost all of you, well, actually all of you, have lived longer than many others. You've already had more time than so many other people. It's been a gift for you. So then how have you scheduled your time? You know, we have these apps on our phones, and you can sync your work calendar, your home calendar, and they can all be to one, and then you think, oh, well, now I'm organized because I have all calendars in one place. But they're still full of certain things, regardless of how you try to be organized. And then this book kind of brought a few things to my mind. He said, you know, what is it that you put on your calendar? What is it you actually put on your calendar? Well, you make sure your work meetings and your work appointments are in there. You make sure all the birthday parties and all the weddings and all the anniversaries that you have to attend. You make sure of all the events that you're going to, all your travels. Those go in the calendar. When was the last time you put this word in your calendar? Home. I'm going to spend time with my kids or my spouse. Does that ever make it into anyone's calendar? Very few people do. And most people think, I'm going to have family night. Father of the year, he spends one night a week with his kids or his spouse, which is awesome. That's less than 15% of, not your time, of your evenings. Less than 15% of your evenings. Well, how much time do you think your kids should get in a week if you have a desire for them to be something amazing? What if you wrote in your schedule 3.5, 4 nights? More than half your evenings you're going to put from 5 to 8 or 4 to 7 when they come home or whenever you're home. I'm going to dedicate. No one can. Like if you have a meeting at work, no matter if someone calls you and says, sorry, I'm busy, I can't move that meeting. Say, sorry, I'm busy, I can't move the time I have with my family. This is like really important. I'm making an investment. I read a story, I don't know if it's a real story, but it proves the point. There was a single father who had a daughter, and he didn't really know how to raise her daughter, and he wasn't super invested, and she'd come and talk to him, he'd be reading his paper, and he'd say, why don't you watch TV? And he'd say, oh, Dad, will you play with me? He's like, why don't you go and outside and play with your friends? And she'd come again, why don't you? And he'd say, just go, talk to other people. So she kept growing and growing, very distant from her father, until she got to her teenage years. The friends became her source of keeping her busy. And she got with the wrong group of friends, as you can imagine. Well, she died. She went to heaven. She's at the judgment seat. They saw that she's lived a horrible, horrible life. And the angels are saying, well, what do we do for her? And the head angel says, don't worry about her. She's good. Find me the one who neglected her. I need to talk to him. And you kind of wonder, have we spent the time where we need it the most? How many of you have put in your schedule Light and Life meeting circled by church for the 3 hours before? It's in your calendar. And it's amazing. Calendars are easy now. You just put it in once and you hit repeat forever. And it just shows up forever. But church is not always like on our calendar. An event that's at church, a prayer meeting, we don't put those on our calendar. If we can, if we want to. How many times do you put prayer time on your calendar? Or is that one of those things in your schedule that can be moved around? From the morning to the evening to the next day to the next week. But if it's in your schedule, on your calendar, say, sorry, this time is given to God. He brings up the point in this book. He says, what if you gave your calendar to God? How do you think God would rearrange your schedule? Do you think he would say, don't go to work? He would let you go to work. But what else would he do? What if you began not only to pray urgently, but to schedule purposefully? What if you took out your calendar and said, you know what? I definitely need to put these prayer times on my calendar. I need to put these times with my church. I need to put these times with my family on my calendar. Put your exercise times, because if they're not in your calendar, they're not going to happen. Some of you guys need to change your life drastically. You're in a wrong career. You're like, well, how do I get out of my career? I don't have the time. Look at your calendar. If you did one night a week in some course, I've heard of people, their whole lives are changed. By putting one night a week, they're taking a master's, and then they get a whole new career that's fulfilling. God is going to say, I gave you so much time. What did you put in your schedule? The next one is invest unswervingly. Unswervingly is not in any English dictionary. I made it up this morning because it rhymes with fervently and urgency. But do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroy and where thieves do not break in. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. God's going to say, I gave you time, and I gave you money. And on that day, he's going to ask you, what did you do with it? He's not going to say, I asked you to give me all of it, but I asked you to give me some of it. I mean, many of us are going to have great excuses because I had to buy a life insurance policy and a disability insurance policy, and I had to buy a 529K and then a 401K, and I have all my receipts for my 503C, and I really need to make sure that all those were in place. So that was where I invested in. It's been my personal experience. I think one of the biggest problems for Christians in America, it's not going to church. It's giving their money to God. It's living not uncomfortably, because that would be horrible for us to live uncomfortably, but to live less comfortably. I know, you're going to the tomatoes are coming out, right? It would be so hard for us. Where does this 10% come from in the New Testament that we have to give 10%? I can't find it anywhere. But when Christ talks about giving, he talks about the lady that gave all. When I read about the church in Macedonia, they gave above and beyond their means. They gave more than they could. They were begging St. Paul to take stuff, and they were being persecuted and they were dying. I invest in a lot of things, and I'm not saying don't invest. It actually is wise to invest. But don't invest all your money in earthly things. The things that I invest in earthly things drive me crazy. I lose sleep at night because the stock market changed, or the interest rates went up and the real estate went down. Never once did I give money to a needy person and I couldn't sleep that night. Actually, that's the best night of sleep I've had. Do you guys know the story of St. Peter the Poor? St. Peter the Poor was rich, initially. And there was a beggar that used to be by his house, and the beggar would bug him, and he'd come home with all this bread, and he's like, give me just one piece of bread, and he didn't want to, and finally he said, here, take a piece. And he threw it at him. That night, he had a dream, Judgment Day. He was before God, a big scale, 2 sides, and the side for evil works was down through the floor. He's like, oh, this is not looking good. He realized he'd done all these things for himself. He spent all his money on himself. And then the angels are like, is there anything good he's done? Can anyone say anything for him? Then the beggar shows up in the dream. He comes, he takes the piece of bread that was thrown at him, and he puts it on the scale for a good deed, and the scale flips over. And then St. Peter saw that, and he was shocked. He said, that was what helped me? Then he decides, I'm no longer buying for myself. He started to give to the poor. He started to sell everything he had for the poor, and then he sold himself so that he could give even that money to the poor. Christ said this parable, make for yourselves friends with unrighteous mammon. On that day, those friends you've made by giving your money to them, they will be at the gate saying, Christ, when I was hungry, that person did feed me. And when I was naked, they actually did give me clothes. And they actually did give me a drink. And it was them that when I lost my house or when this happened, I lost my job. Have you ever read the book Unfinished by Richard Stearns? He's the president of World Vision. He tells this awesome story, and when I tell it, it breaks my heart. He gives a story of these people that get stranded on an island. 10 guys, they're on an island, and one guy starts to pray, and all of a sudden, he's on the island, and this basket full of everything he needs. A pack of M&Ms, something to start fire, a water purifier, a Keurig coffee, everything he needs. He's like, thank you, Lord, for sending me this. And then he uses it for himself. Well, the other 9 are starving. As if he thought that God sent him something that it was going to be just for him. God sends him things to spend it just on himself. You say, how ridiculous. Of course he would share it with all the others. How ridiculous is it for us to not share with all the others? Just because God sent the basket to you doesn't mean that they didn't pray as well, and then God sent it to you to give to them. What if you invested heavenly? We invest earthly all the time. What if you invested heavenly? So that when that time comes, you have all those friends saying, please let this person in. They've done so much for me. So I want you to pray urgently. I want you to schedule purposefully. I want you to invest heavenly. And then I want you to love fervently. This is right after the verse where he says, the end of all things is at hand. Pray. And then he says, and above all things, everything and if time is at hand, above all things, have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. Notice how he didn't say just have love. He says have fervent love. Yesterday at the funeral, which I just found this out yesterday, that the funeral for women, the gospel they read is where the woman washes Christ's feet before his burial. I thought that's an awesome gospel. Like she offered, because I know what Christ said to the other lady that washed his feet. You know, the sinner, the adulterous woman, said, because she who was forgiven much, loved much. You know how people say you should always choose a life verse? Like go look in the Bible and find a verse that like inspires you, and this is like your core verse for your life. I don't have a verse, but one of my favorite verses is when Christ said, she loved much. See, this is when you start thinking about your funeral. What are people going to say? He was nice, and his hair looked great. And I just want to bring that in because I don't have great hair today because I stayed at Abuna's house. He does not have gel or shaving cream. So that's my excuse. That's why it's like this. But people will not come to your funeral talking about that you dressed nicely, or that your house was nice, or that your car was nice, or that you worked hard at your job. They might even skip your funeral day, except for this one thing. They'll say, that person touched my life in a way I will never be the same. I am better because I have known that person. That person loved me. That's not have a coffee with someone kind of love. That's not like someone's obnoxious selfie on Facebook kind of love. That is, you've invested yourself in someone. They're the kind of person that when you need something, you can't wait to call them, but the problem is they always call you first. They just happen to know. They just happen to be there. You know how people, when there's like a funeral and people visit you the first day, but then there's the person when everyone else leaves, they come the second day and the third day? The person that thinks of others before themselves. Like when Christ was going to die and he wanted to leave an impression, his end time was coming, and what did he do? In John 13 it says this, he loved his own who are in the world, and he loved them to the end. And then he washed their feet. And he says to his disciples, now go and love others as I have loved you. Wouldn't it be amazing not to know people who have loved you, but to be the person that when they walk in the room, you cannot wait to hug them. Like this person is precious to you because they have made you feel precious to them. So I was thinking about this. Christ did it through service and washing the feet of another. And I thought, how am I going to make this work with all that I read in that book? And I said, you know what? I should probably schedule purposefully a time for loving others, of thinking of others first. So, I just read this book on the plane, so I haven't done this yet, but now I'm thinking Thursday nights. It's a time where I'm going to have to think about all the people I know. Who could I call? Who could I reach out to? Who could I pray especially for? Who could I send that text to that will lift them up? I don't know if they need it, but I feel like God is telling me to send it. That I will be the person where they say, or you would be the person where everyone says, I'm going to miss them because they love me so much. I'm almost done. If you guys prayed urgently from now on, do it for the next 2 weeks. The end of the Coptic year is 2 weeks. Pray urgently for the next 2 weeks. Really write something in your calendar and schedule it purposefully so that you're scheduling of who you want to become. Start thinking about where your money has gone, and do you have an investment in heaven? And then think, who could I love right now? Who are the people that are really close to me that I want them to know that I love them to death? And then probably the most important thing I need you to do is act immediately. If you wait, you will find yourself in the same situation that you were in at this time last year, and at the last retreat, and at the last Holy Week, and at the last sermon that you said, I am going to, but you never did. Look at this verse that St. Paul writes. He says, therefore we make it our aim, like this is his life purpose, whether present or absent, to be well-pleasing to him, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. This is St. Paul, who later in this book, he says, I was whipped, I was beaten, I was stoned, I was shipwrecked, I did everything for Christ. He says, but that we might receive the things done in the body to what he has done, whether good or bad. He's like, that's it. I know I'm going to be there. My end time is going to come. What is your life verse? What is it that you want to become? God gave you time, he gave you money, he gave you the opportunity to pray, and he gave you a heart to love. I pray that you be the people that God wants you to be. May God bless this group now and always and forever. Amen.